Let's start the fourth and last panel of the day. I am Damian Cardona from the United Nations Information Center, and I've been invited, I guess, to moderate this panel, not because the UN is so small in Australia. We are only 3 offices, and IOM, of course, you know, because they are co-hosting this event, UNHCR, and us. We are our offices in the old Parliament House, and that's it. That is a very, very small presence of the UN. But I believe that one of the reasons why I've been invited is because our department, the Department of Global Communications of the Secretariat, is working a lot for the past few years in disinformation, and also in all the consequences of disinformation that can lead to hate speech and other terrible consequences. So disinformation has become something that, when I was working in New York a few years ago, we talked about this to member states. Nobody paid too much attention. You know, they all thought, oh, that's for teenagers. You know, it's not really. Then a few years later, they realized governments can lose elections or win elections because of disinformation. So then they asked the Secretariat of the UN to pay special attention, and we are actually going to sign in a few weeks in New York during the General Assembly, in the Summit of the Future, a global digital compact, precisely giving an umbrella to all the issues that has to do with disinformation, etc. One of the main risks is that when we talk about disinformation started many, many years ago when we had terrible examples of its effects, like in Rwanda 30 years ago, and I mean, there are so many examples, but one of the things that really has changed the importance of disinformation is 2 things. One is the sophistication of its means. I mean, now you see videos that you think they are completely real, deep fakes, or however they want to be called. And second, the speed of the dissemination, because this has been, of course, through social media. In Rwanda, the example I said, it was only a radio station that disseminated all this hate that ended up with a genocide. Imagine if in Rwanda they had 30 years ago social media. I cannot imagine the numbers. But anyway, I'm not the one to speak because we have excellent panelists here today and they're going to be the ones talking. But Alan and the organizers have told me also that the speakers will have a short presentation, but then we'll really encourage the dialogue. We already have some questions. Maybe some of you posed already these questions, but we will try to make it as interactive as possible. So our 3 panelists today starts on my right with Marie McAuliffe. Is the head of the Migration Research and Publications Division at IOM headquarters in Geneva, and is the editor of the IOM's flagship World Migration Report, one of those truth reports, no? That against disinformation. It's true that the UN for many years has been known by the accuracy and the good quality of the global reports, and in particular the one that IOM, that Marie is on the lead. Marie has researched, published, and edited widely in academic and policy spheres on migration, and is on the editorial boards of 3 scientific migration journals, and is an associate editor of the Harvard Data Science Review. She's a regular contributor to the World Economic Forum Agenda blog series and is affiliated with universities and think tanks in Australia, ANU, India, Switzerland, and the United States. In 2015, Marie was awarded a Sir Roland Wilson Scholarship to conduct doctoral research at the ANU School of Demography, and is the 2018 recipient of the Charles Prize for outstanding doctoral research. She is regularly called upon to advise presidents, ministers, senior officials, and CAO on global dynamics in migration and displacement. So, Marie, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Damien. I'll come up here.
Sure.
Thanks so much. And then I've got a really short PowerPoint slide. I'll be fast once we get it up and running. There it is. Thanks. Okay. This is from a special rapporteur. We were just talking about special rapporteurs. The key part here is disinformation is definitely not a new phenomenon, as we know, and it's exactly what you're talking about in terms of the Digital Global Compact. I think we're up to Rev 3 at the moment.
Yes.
We'll be finalising that for the Summit of the Future. Digital technology is enabling disinformation to be spread at scale and very, very widely and this is the bit that I like about Irene Khan's little quote here, is that it's being spread by various actors, nefarious actors in particular, for political, ideological or commercial motives. And this is really important. There are mixed motivations in terms of disinformation across a very wide range of topics, and unfortunately growing topics too. Oops, now I've gone too far. It's a bit of a lag effect on this one. So it's not working. Okay. I've highlighted in the green box, this is just an example of disinformation not being new, but the technology is new. So this is a recent piece of research, 2020, using artificial intelligence technologies to look at 100 years of media reporting in the Times in the UK. And it's very interesting because when they've done sentiment analysis, they have found that over a full century, and we have to recall that only rich countries would be able to do this because they actually have collected all of the data, they have also digitalised it. But the analysis shows that immigration was consistently portrayed negatively, whereas emigration from the UK, particularly to Northern America, has been particularly around the positives. So we talk about disinformation now in this century, but this is a long-standing issue, and it's about interest. And those motives, if we think about the motives politically, maybe not commercially for this one, and maybe not in regards to other aspects, but certainly the politics speak very, very strongly to this. Disinformation and misinformation has increased, not only about migration, but especially about migration, because it is a very prominent migration topic at national and international levels. We've heard that extensively this morning. Unfortunately, rigorous and evidence-based analysis alongside that continue to be diminished. Here's some examples. I've just been asked a question actually during the break on disinformation and misinformation on migration. What has IOM been doing on this at the global level? There's a few examples. We have unfortunately, had to cover the context of misinformation and disinformation across the last 4 World Migration Report editions, but taking different slices. It is a perennial issue. Other research outputs, particularly focusing on less researched, under-researched geographies such as Nigeria, Bangladesh, Malaysia, and so forth. We often hear about it from a Western perspective from the global north, but disinformation and misinformation on migration is occurring at scale right the way around the world. Here, in terms of the World Migration Report, which I presented this morning, I just wanted to share one thing that I've highlighted there. This was an independent study that was done by the Graduate Institute in Geneva, and it was through a competitive funding round by the Geneva Science Policy Interface. It was really looking at the policy use, policy officials using the World Migration Report, and this was about developing a digital toolkit. One of the things that I found most interesting and somewhat surprising, but then having worked inside government, I can also understand how this occurs, that the WMR was used extensively by policy officials within the closed policy environments to combat misinformation that was occurring in those closed environments. The research that was done for this by the Graduate Institute was of people working in capital, such as in Canberra, but also at permanent missions in Geneva and in New York. So it was quite an interesting finding that we wouldn't see publicly, but through this structured interviews as well as questionnaires and focal group sessions, they found that that is how the World Migration Report is used as a fact-based tool. Some of the digital tools that we have invested in pretty heavily have been focused on enabling much greater access and reach, particularly around data, key migration data, but also a new education toolkit that is now used very extensively and available in multiple languages. It's one of those tools where you want people to be using it in real time, so you are essentially doing as much of the work as possible so that teachers can be teaching about migration, particularly in high school settings. But what we have been a little surprised to find is that it's also been used at undergraduate levels. So we're seeing university lecturers using the World Migration Report Education Toolkit extensively for undergraduates. It provides up-to-date information. It's currently being updated for the current edition. We're adding some more modules on key issues as well. It's available in a digital format. It's interactive, and we've won several awards for it. It is really based on high school IB diploma kind of level, but it cuts across a whole range of different issues such as gender, climate change, digital technology, how those big global issues intersect with migration and mobility. This is from one of our partners, International Baccalaureate, based in Europe. They use it not only for their high school IB diploma, but also for increasingly for middle year programming, as well as the DP core and the individual units. We've worked with them extensively in terms of developing a professional teaching tool, but not in the content. The content is very much independent, and it's peer reviewed by teachers at the high school level, as well as university lecturers working in the undergraduate space in particular. And then the IB team will use it as a professional development tool for their teachers throughout the world. Lastly, we're working together with a number of different partners to digitalise what is currently just in a PDF format. It is a fact checkers toolkit. We had the pleasure to present on migration for the first time at Global Fact 11. It is a global conference that is for fact checkers all around the world who work in real time, and presented the World Migration Report and migration in that. And we will work with them going forward using the new content to develop a set of interactive digital tools for fact checkers on migration. And we're increasingly working with generative AI tech companies. We do a lot of post-training assessments in regards to the LLMs, such as for ChatGPT, to then test the content that the Gen AI tools are producing, so that we're not embedding misinformation and disinformation in real time. And this has got huge potential. It's a very challenging environment. I'm sure we'll get onto artificial intelligence technologies, as Damien mentioned. But to combat some of the potential for mass misrepresentation at scale, we have to be working with the tech companies to be able to make sure that that is embedded right the way through their processes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marie. And indeed, your report, I was based in Dakar, in Senegal, covering all Central and West Africa. And every year we had several presentations of reports. I will not mention which were the other ones, but the one that had the most attention was the IOM World Migration Report, really. It was really, really by media, by everybody, and of course the countries that are migration origin. But anyway, so let's go to our next colleague and panelist. Dr. Abul Rizvi is an independent Australian columnist who frequently provides media comments on development in immigration policy. He was a senior official in the Department of Immigration from the early 90s to the rank of Deputy Secretary in 2005 and until 2007. Prior to this, Mr. Risby was Chief Finance Officer in the department from 1991 to 1995 and managed policy and delivery of Australia's migration program from 1995 to 2007. He was awarded the Public Service Medal and the Centenary Medal for Services to Development and Implementation of Immigration Policy, including the reshaping of Australia intake to focus on skilled migration, the growth of temporary skilled migration and development of pathways for highly successful overseas students to permanent residence. He holds a Bachelor of Economics from ANU and a PhD from the University of Melbourne. Abul, the floor is yours.
Thank you, everyone. I won't answer the question, how do you deal with disinformation, because I'm not sure I have the answer. But what I'll try to do is describe some of the sources and the methods behind some of the disinformation. While we get most of our information on immigration via the media, both mainstream media and social media, there are probably 5 or so sources of that information, other than stuff that people just make up. First, there is the data on immigration published by various government organisations, but in particular the Bureau of Statistics and the Department of Home Affairs. Other agencies also publish immigration-related data relevant to them. For example, the Department of Education publishes data on students. These data sources are generally quite reliable, except that these organisations determine which data they will publish. There is data they won't publish, when they will publish it, and often they'll delay publishing for whatever reason, and in what form. Surprisingly often how they publish the data in forms that are really very difficult to use. I don't know whether they do that deliberately or not. Second, we have a range of think tanks that specialise in immigration policy, and these exist all around the world. But in Australia, for example, there's the Australian Population Research Institute, or TAPRI, which is a bunch of anti-immigration academics, or say the Kaldor Centre, which is a bunch of pro-immigration academics. You can know what these think tanks will conclude without actually reading their reports, because they always conclude the same thing. Third, there are think tanks that dip their oar into immigration policy from time to time. For example, the Institute of Public Affairs on the right and the Chifley Research Centre on the left. These think tanks almost always find that the major party that they support got things right and the other mob got it wrong. You don't have to read the reports. Fourth, we have lobby groups who can be relied upon to promote policies that favour their members while dressing these up as being in the national interest. Most major business lobby groups, and I dealt with these for many, many years, all want higher levels of immigration, couldn't understand why we wanted to manage to a particular target. They want fewer regulations that protect migrants, even though they say their highest priority is to protect migrants and the workers they have, and for migrants not to be paid too much. For example, all the major business lobby groups supported the freezing of the minimum salary for skilled temporary entrants for around a decade and strongly opposed it to being increased about 13 months ago. Finally, we have government agencies that either do their own research or commission such research from expert academics or commission special inquiries. We heard some of those earlier today. In the immigration space, the zenith of government doing immigration research, at least in terms of funding, was the old Bureau of Immigration. Some of you may remember it from the early 1990s. The BIR was abolished by the Howard government for allegedly being too pro-immigration, although I'm not sure that was entirely true, but nevertheless that was the perception and that was the rationale given. With its research and statistics function being transferred back into the department. The department continued to undertake, as well as commission immigration research, until the formation of the Department of Home Affairs, when it was considered immigration research was no longer needed. The department appears to be trying to partly resurrect that function. It's hard to tell from the outside, but it is coming off, I would say, a very low base, probably the lowest level of immigration research that the government, that the Department of Home Affairs in immigration, the immigration area at least, did for a very long time. That lack of research function would have partly contributed to, I think, to the government being caught napping on the blowout of net migration in 22-23. A better research function would have had the department advising the government what's coming and what their options were. Instead, what we ended up with was a department and a government caught flat-footed, and now that I'm no longer a public servant, I'm allowed to use this word, politically panicked. A couple of really good examples of misinformation in the last 3 or 4 weeks would be firstly visas for Gazans, where we are being told these people will be an enormous national security threat to us. If you look at the reality, this is a cohort of people who entered Australia having gone through probably more security checks than any cohort that's ever entered Australia in our history. Yet we are being asked to be very, very scared. The second area is student caps, where we are told that the government's policies are about to trigger a recession. A number of academics have come out and said that, quite prominent academics, people who I respect. We've had the Victorian Treasurer tell us Victoria's state finances will be depleted as a result of this. And we are being told in the West that the government in particular is picking on the University of Western Australia. Not sure entirely why. The reality is, on my calculations, the student caps won't be reached. For the vast majority of providers, they will not get enough visas to meet their caps, because if current visa processing arrangements continue, those caps won't be met. And yet we are being told to panic. I don't know what the answer to fixing this sort of disinformation is, but it seems to just continue and continue. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Abul. And I said before about one of the effects of disinformation, hate speech. Another one that everybody agrees is polarization. And when you mention how horrible, that you don't have to read a report because you know what is going to be on it. So that's sort of, anyway. Anyway, our last but not least speaker is Mr. Tom McClory, the Financial Review political correspondent, reporting from the Federal Press Gallery at Parliament House. He's a regular commentator on national affairs and has written for several newspapers, including The Age, the Sydney Morning Herald, and the Canberra Times. Tom?
Good afternoon. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for the invitation. And conscious that I'm coming to the subject of today's conference probably the least prepared of anyone in the room, given that I'm usually calling experts like you to commentate in our newspaper rather than the other way around. But the topic is particularly pertinent coming into an election year in Australia, where migration will be a key issue in the campaign and something that both sides of politics, or all sides of politics, want to talk about quite a lot. As a starting message, I think I bring some bad news. That is that the confluence of cost of living politics in the economy, the lacklustre state of economic growth, the poor standing of the political parties, including the government, mean combined that migration is a real potential area for misinformation and disinformation in the political campaign. And necessarily that means it'll be reflected in the media at times, potentially unhelpful to those people who are trying to counter misinformation. Equally, I think the media has an important role, the political media in particular, has an important role in countering bad information with good information and showing up people who are peddling bad information, explaining to our readers and our viewers and our listeners why that is the case and what their motivations are. Briefly, the current state of the debate is not great in this area, and I think Abul gave us a good introduction to that. There are competing plans for cuts to Australia's overseas migration intake, including in areas like international students and other parts of the economy and the community. Neither side is prepared to say clearly what their plans are or to hold them up to much scrutiny. Already that's a challenge for people in my profession trying to explain the numbers and the motivations behind them. I think it goes without saying that the politicians are trying to send different messages about their policies and their plans to different parts of the community, trying to win votes with tailored messages in different places around the country and people coming to the debate from different perspectives. That can be a good thing, sometimes it can be challenging as well. I think it's incumbent on the media, people like myself, to work hard to show up the strengths and weaknesses of these competing policies, give voters as much information as they can, and of course that includes asking for contributions from experts in the field to round out our information, our newspaper articles, etc., so people have the best information. I think good information is always the best response to bad information. Unfortunately, sometimes the media, and I include the political media and the press gallery in this, the business model doesn't always suit careful analysis and considered sustained analysis. The 24-hour news cycle, competition between journalists and media outlets, and the confected environment of an election campaign all undermine efforts to spread good information, and we need to work each day to try and push back on that as much as possible, get good answers and give good information to our news consumers. Even today, working on a piece about the international student caps, I've struggled to exactly understand motivations, test positions that politicians are putting, and listening to some of the contributions in this session already, you get a good insight into the strengths and weaknesses of picking up the phone to a think tank or a political party or an expert from a university, because they come from such different perspectives. We also found this with the promises of cuts to net overseas migration and permanent migration in Australia, rubbery figures, contested claims, confusion among the political players. And in our earlier session today with the Assistant Minister, Matt Thistlethwaite, I thought it was interesting that he specifically mentioned the social media-fueled riots in the United Kingdom and other contested areas touching migration. I think it shows the importance of good information pushing against bad. And so I'll finish my remarks with an appeal for your assistance as much as possible in countering bad information in the media, particularly the political media. It's such an important thing for voters to understand, and journalists like me rely on experts like you all the time to point us in the right direction, steer us away from bad information. And so I'm thrilled to be here, and thank you very much.
Okay. Okay, so thank you very much, Tom. And now, one of the good things about this beautiful room is that it's round. So let's make a round table here, and hopefully we can have exchanges. We already have some questions that were posed beforehand. If those persons are here, please, you can question yourself. For example, John Van Cooy, are you here? Oh, so do you want to pose your question, please?
Thank you, and thanks to the panel for very interesting provocations. My question is for anyone who wishes to answer it. Earlier we heard from Assistant Minister Thistlethwaite about building support for the immigration program. Minister Giles, previous Minister Giles, also had a similar kind of line about building the social license for the program. So my question to the panel is what is just one policy reform initiative or investment that could be made to rebuild support for the Australian immigration program?
So, I think they're like different, the questions, so maybe we can answer this one, yeah?
I think the key thing that and I'm not sure whether this would solve it, perhaps I'm just being naive, but I think the government has failed to adequately explain its long-term strategy for migration, even though it's put one out. I read the strategy, got lots of lovely words. Does it resonate with me? I'm sorry, it doesn't. And I looked after the migration program for a decade. Unless the government can explain the migration program in a way that helps us as a society to understand its rationale, I think we will continue to have people who peddle disinformation win the debate. And I think that's what's happening at the moment. I think the government's got to find a way of communicating a rationale that connects with the bulk of Australians.
Thank you. Is Professor Glenn Withers with us? Oh, yeah, so please.
Hi, Glenn Withers here. I in fact didn't think I was going to be here, and I left about 4 questions. So
Yes.
I won't go through all of those. And indeed, some of them have been answered, such as what lessons we learned from the demise of the Bureau of Immigration, Population and Multicultural Research, and would the same issues apply to something like the Centre for Population Studies today inside Treasury? Is it safe and secure? Those sorts of questions. Also, questions about how you get public servants to look at material beyond what the other central agencies look at, what the line agencies look at, what the state governments look at, what the international central agencies look at, but also what do academics look at. I've done work inside government whereby the public servants I've dealt with, including many with PhDs, do not look beyond their own immediate central linkages, and they never look at academic work. How do you change those incentives to induce them to make sure they too look for independent work and not find a commission consultancy is the best answer to that question. But the final question I wanted to actually ask is not on the list. It's a bigger existential question that just kept coming into my mind as I heard everyone speaking, which was, as a society, the 2 key independent intermediary institutions that we've relied upon for keeping us closer to the truth have been public interest journalism and university research. Both are severely challenged, if not compromised, today. Do people on the panel have an answer as how we make those sources of independent examination of the propositions that we rely on for the good society better than seems to be the case emerging? Thank you.
I might go first, but I will only really be able, Glenn, to answer the question from a global perspective. I'm one of those UN officials that flew in on the weekend, and you would not want to hear from me because my cultural gap is so big, even though I sound like I'm homegrown. In fact, I am homegrown, but I now work globally. So all I can really offer is sort of reflections on a couple of different kind of aspects. The ability to work across divides, I think is, and I'm talking about sectors, policy, academic research, but not just academic research. We are very clear within our area of work and responsibility and portfolio for IOM is that applied researchers are critically important because often the incentive structures for academia are quite different to other settings and other sectors. So applied researchers, what Dimitri Papadimitriou would have called the migration policy scholars, are really, really critical. Those with qualifications in academia, but they're able to transcend not just the academic environment, but also the policy environment. That is very difficult to create. It can be done with the right people in the right place at the right time, if there is the will. And when the Bureau was demolished, a lot of people were very, very unhappy about that and tried to resurrect it over many years and in many different ways, but largely unsuccessfully. It's got to have space in terms of the ecosystem that is operating. Governments have to be able to manage the ability for people to work independently. And I see that occurring in many countries around the world, but in other countries, there is no space, particularly, of course, in autocratic regimes. It is incredibly important, but what I see as the long-term trajectory, because of the introduction of social media, media platforms, what Damien was talking about in terms of the digital technology, is taking us in quite a different direction. And my concern is very much about mass-scaled disinformation through technology. And that's a really important and critical issue, not just for us in the room, but for our grandchildren, for our children, depending on how old we are, our great-grandchildren and so forth. The next generations will find it even more difficult to locate the misinformation and the disinformation within growing platforms that are increasingly sophisticated. And this was a key area of discussion in Sarajevo at Global Fact 11. That is the big challenge that is emerging on the horizon. And I really do wonder how policymakers are talking about this internally. I would be fascinated to know. Those digital platforms and the cyber issues are very, very, very pronounced, including from nefarious state and non-state actors. So not too good in terms of how we might be able to build this capability, but I do think some of the aspects in regards to working with the technology systems and the technology platforms and the tech companies is a must. It's not, oh, it would be nice to. I think it's essential to be working in that space with them. Many of them, like working in government, understand the risks, understand the challenges, and they're quite willing and open to be able to improve the products so that they are not enabling and facilitating mass levels of disinformation and misinformation. Thanks.
Thank you. Is in the room Jade Anderson? Yes? Okay. So, and then Caroline Bull.
Hi again. Thank you very much. That was a really interesting conversation. My question was really around the kind of policy labels that we attach to human mobility. And I'm just wondering what you guys think, how these labels contribute to or challenge the myths which permeate the migration debate globally and in Australia.
That's an easy one for me.
Oh, good. Okay, good.
Oh, we get this all the time. I think and we've got a little text box in chapter 2, which is the global chapter of the World Migration Report. A lot of people in the room have worked on this, including James, quite deeply around the terminology. It is complex, but there are many different terms around concepts of migration and mobility that are derived historically. They've got normative frameworks around them. They're negotiated outcomes between member states, particularly the UN Statistical Commission. And depending on what you're working on, whether you're working in policy, programmatic areas, analysis at the global level, at the regional level, national level, subnational levels, you will be using a very different definition because you want to answer a different question in different contexts. That's really, really very important. But that nuance, which is rooted often in legislation, international, national, subnational, as we heard from Philip Martin this morning, different states in the US have very different approaches, and that's based in legal frameworks. So that's the first point that always needs to be made. There are many different definitions and concepts and terms because it depends on what you're talking about. It's really, really important, but for media and for articles, it's super boring. Like, it's just not that sexy, really, is it? I remember answering a media inquiry in the late 2019, before COVID, and it was the World Migration Report 2020. The journalist was on the other end of the phone saying, so what you're really telling me is that most migration is safe, it's orderly, it's regular. Human displacement is the minority, but yes, there are critical issues there, and irregular migration is actually really, really small globally. And everything is managed quite well. I said, yes. Well, that's not a story. I can't publish that. It's like, I'm sorry, but that's the actual truth. That isn't to say that we don't have challenges. That isn't to say that internal displacement is not a huge issue that is really, well, we've had some changes with the internal displacement action agenda by the Secretary-General, but it's really under-researched. It's not well known. The links between internal displacement and cross-border displacement are very muted, and there really needs to be a huge amount of work done there. But it is to say that most migration around the world has historically been and will continue to be positive, well-managed, safe, regular, orderly. It's that very small part that takes up, which we heard in panel sessions earlier this morning, that takes up a huge amount of space. And that's not specific to migration, but it's very much about migration.
I might just say something about that in an Australian context, if that's okay. I reckon about a year ago, 90, perhaps 95% of Australians would have never heard of the term net overseas migration. The percentage is probably now 80, 85, I don't know, probably pretty high now. By now, they will have heard of the term net overseas migration. But I suspect still only about 10 or 20% of them understand what it means, if that. Yet, we are going to go into an election next year where the two contesting parties will talk incessantly about net overseas migration, and the vast bulk of the public will have no idea what they're talking about.
I would just add, and I think it's pertinent to a couple of the questions, I think one method of promoting good information in the public sphere and the media sphere from public service, government, academia as well, is a more open conversation, less focus on the risk of public servants and academics speaking out and potentially saying the wrong thing, more focus on the opportunity that they could explain, educate, provide proper context around things when the media asks for information. You know, the culture here in Canberra, I'm sure my fellow panellists have seen this, it's very difficult for a practicing journalist to speak to a public servant. Junior, senior, whatever, it's very difficult. The politicians stand in the way, the media people stand in the way, it's constant, very difficult. And I think it's a bad trend that's continued for years and years.
Yeah, but Tom, as Marie said, I think good news never make it to the headlines, no?
Well, Marie's point is exactly right, and it's a structural weakness of the news media, particularly newspapers. You know, this terrible expression that we sometimes say, if it bleeds, it leads. Bad news is at the front of the newspaper. I think partly the internet is fixing that a little bit. There's much more space and there's much more, you know, there are trends in media where sometimes people say, I want to understand the full picture, not just the bad news. But yeah, that's a challenge for us, and I don't back away from it.
And it's a challenge that has been taken up by our new Director General. She is very focused on trying to change the narrative and put in the positives, not just the challenges around migration. I think that is working, but you do have to have a particular charismatic sort of leadership to be able to do that, because quite often if you're even drafting a press briefing note to put out for the World Migration Report, it goes into the media team and it's just like, well, you know, we need the crunchy kind of, you know, if it, I've never heard that before, but if it bleeds, it leads. That's nice. We'll be using that back home. So to be able to make it newsworthy, because it won't get picked up. And that's part of the challenge. I mean, what we have tended to do, we've changed our practices to provide pre-briefing for embargoed copies and answer questions from journalists around the world so that they have a more full picture and have the opportunity to really ask about, you know, well, what about the terminology question? What's the difference between this term and that term? How does it fit in? Why are you using this? How are you explaining this? And that leads to better stories. It leads to kind of the, you know, the long reads, as they call them. And then it leads to other sessions and other types of outputs. I was joking with the team recently about, well, in terms of communicating migration, maybe we need a TikTok account. And I said, where have you been? We've got a TikTok account. It's got 1.5 million, you know, users. I'm like, okay, well, good.
Thank you, Marie. Is Caroline Bull with us? Or if not, I will pose the question on her behalf. Okay, she is the deputy head of the College of ANU National Security College. And the question reads as follows. Myths and disinformation about the migration national security nexus can distort migration debates and policies. To what extent do you think migration is an over-securitized issue? What, if any, is the evidence base for the proposition that migration can challenge or strengthen national security?
I would say read the chapter on migration and human security, which is about tackling myths and the over-securitized framing of migration. The real issue around migration and security is human security. That is very key and front and center, and that was understood for a very long time up until, if we want to get into the kind of the academic part, it's the Copenhagen School, which is the new issues in security. It's been escalated by 9/11, amongst other big global geopolitical events. But we worked with a number of different partners for this particular chapter, particularly to take a very long-term historical view on migration and security and highlight some of the also policy challenges and what can be done to improve human security and human rights right the way throughout the migration cycle. In some parts of the world, the national security framing dominates, but in other parts of the world, it's very, very much about human security. And here we are really looking at origin and destination countries, but very specific destination countries. So if you're interested in the topic, and I think Carolyn has left, but that would be the chapter I would suggest that she reads.
In Australia, of course, we created the Department of Home Affairs because we were scared that migrants would do nasty things to us. Yet there was no evidence to back that up. The thesis for the creation of the Department of Home Affairs was not based on any report or research or evidence or fact. There was no evidence that migrants presented any sort of particular greater threat to Australians, yet that is what we did. We created the Department of Home Affairs. We put in it policy on national security, ASIO, AFP. We created the Australian Border Force. We gave them dark uniforms. We gave them guns. Not sure anyone's ever actually had to pull one of those guns out, but they have them just in case. And all it did was scare Australians for absolutely no reason, no good reason whatsoever. And I would agree with the recommendations of the Multicultural Framework Review that it's time the department was dismantled.
I would just add that I agree with the earlier comments. I think the new Home Affairs Minister here in Australia, Tony Burke, has said publicly that he would like a reframing of immigration away from the security side, which will be a challenge for him, but it's encouraging to hear him say that. I think Minister Thistlethwaite is the same, and we saw some of that this morning. But unfortunately, I have a dim view of how that works in an election year. I think it's difficult because the motivation is so strong on the other side.
Thank you very, very much. We are exhausted our time, but I think we had a very interesting panel, so thank you very much, Tom, Abul, and Marie. I think 3 different perspectives that were very, very well balanced, to get your global one, of course, but also the experience in government and the journalist, which is extremely important. So thank you very much for having been with us here this afternoon, and I believe it's your turn, Alan, to close the day. Thank you.
Very good. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Cheers, Betty. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Tony, very much.
Thank you.
Okay, well, big day, and we're now coming to the end of it. Thank you so much, everybody, for making time to be here. By way of closing remarks, I just wanted to reflect on some of the discussions that we've had today. on this really important topic of countering myths and delivering facts on migration. Hopefully some of you will stick around for the Pacific Migration Workshop tomorrow. There's the State of the Pacific conference the 2 days after that, and then we've got the School of Demography's symposium on Friday, so hopefully some of you will stick around for the rest of the week. But on the topic today, I mean, I guess on one hand, it's just really good for a group such as this, a kind of community of practice, to meet on a regular basis and have discussions about the issues that concern us professionally. And I think it's very important that we keep doing that. I would say, reiterating what many of the speakers have said today, that this topic is really urgent and important. Migration has become one of the biggest election issues in the biggest election year ever, and yet the public understanding of the issue is at an all-time low. There's misinformation everywhere, and we need to counter that with facts. That's an urgent societal problem. From the start, Mari McAuliffe gave us a global overview of migration based on the World Migration Report, which she leads. That's become a key kind of fact bomb. Maybe I shouldn't use that word, but it's become like a very important piece of reliable information and evidence about migration at a time when myths and misinformation about the topic are swirling everywhere. It provides a real steady anchor for public discussion. So congratulations, Mari and your team. Thank you again for being with us. In this second session on global trends that was chaired by Sanushka Mudlia, we heard about the updates to what's happening in the Pacific migration space, in North American migration, and about trends in the global governance of migration. And there's so many echoes of the things that we find important here in Australia that we read about in the media all the time. And it's through comparing our own experience and looking beyond Australia to those other contexts that we get a sense of a bigger picture and where the Australian migration system fits in them, in that bigger picture. So thank you so much to that panel as well. We then had a panel on data innovations chaired by Justin Douglas, and of course, you know, the point to emphasise there is just how important it is to have accurate, accessible data in shaping effective migration policies, not just to clear up the myths and provide accurate information to guide public debates, but actually to inform the people who are devising very technical changes that affect, you know, hundreds of thousands of lives and billions of dollars. So we really need that this community of practice to keep on coming together and talking about the data advances and the analytical advances that are required. Thank you very much to that panel. Our new Assistant Minister for Immigration, Matt Thistlethwaite, talked about how misinformation can undermine the social licence for the migration program and distract from these really necessary changes, a 10-year rebuild of the program, of the migration system, and you know, announced $104 million of funding for a renewal of Australia's multicultural framework. And then, of course, in the afternoon, we looked at emerging challenges chaired by Has Dalal, who had just led the report that the multicultural framework review that led to that investment. We heard how state government and settlement sector agencies, how they see the state of multiculturalism at the moment, what needs to happen. We heard about Pacific migration, maybe some of the, you know, we hear a lot of positive things about Pacific migration, but we saw some of the warts in this presentation about the Pacific migration as well. And we also heard about some of the key issues that this new expert subcommittee of the government is starting to face as well. So, you know, hopefully all of that, for those of us who are researchers in the room, started to get us thinking about knowledge gaps, where it might be interesting to do research, where that research might be, you know, helpful to feed into further conversations with the people from other sectors in this room. And of course, one of the most important sessions was the final one on how to counter myths and deliver facts and to improve the migration debate. Particularly grateful to Damien for chairing and for the emphasis on the role of key institutions, including educational institutions, the public service agencies, the media, in shaping public views about migration, and the role of those institutions in making sure that the debate is anchored to facts rather than sort of free-floating, dealing with fiction. So at a time when migration can spread so quickly and have real destabilising effects on our communities, we really need to spend more time and effort, those of us who know the issue very well, and work doubly hard to ensure that the debates we have in public, in policymaking circles, are based on facts and logic, not fear and misinformation. I want to thank all the speakers, the panellists, the moderators, for all of their valuable contributions, which I'm sure will help guide research and policymaking work in the months and hopefully years ahead. I also want to thank our partners, the Department of Home Affairs and the United Nations Migration Agency, IOM, whose support has been really key to making today a success and bringing us together. We're really looking forward to continuing the work together. And a personal thank you to my team, who've worked very hard to organise this event. Maybe if you could all stand up, those of you who are involved in organisation, carrying mics, Chanel and team, and if we can give all of them a round of applause. And of course, finally, to all of you who participated, thanks for your involvement and your commitment to this important issue. As we leave, I hope we all carry forward this resolve to try and counter myths and deliver facts and to make a better migration debate in our own areas of influence. And in finishing, I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about some of our plans on that front. At last year's migration update, a senior policymaker in the audience asked a question: are you planning to build this into a major migration institute? 10 months later, I wanted to report some progress on that front. The ANU Migration Hub is co-leading an effort to build a migration centre of excellence with a consortium of top universities, government agencies and NGOs around Australia and internationally. This is a groundbreaking initiative that we hope will redefine how we understand, manage and benefit from migration in Australia and beyond. Migration is more than just the movement of people across borders. It's a transformative force that shapes societies, economies, and nations. Australia, of course, understands this better than most because half our population is either first or second generation migrants. Migration is fundamental to our national identity, to our economic prosperity, and to our place in the world. But despite its central place in this national story, migration remains one of the most misunderstood and contentious issues in public discourse today. A significant portion of the Australian public have demonstrably false beliefs about migration. Their concerns are often amplified by media narratives that link migration to issues such as inflation, housing affordability, crime, terrorism, and social cohesion. Politicians, in response, often propose drastic increases, surges, or cuts to immigration without fully understanding the broader implications of such actions. In other words, migration is one of the most divisive issues of our time, but most people don't understand how it actually works. And that includes many of our key decision makers and opinion shapers. This is leading to toxic debates and policy decisions that only make things worse. Better understanding of migration has become a major societal and scientific challenge. But Australia has really fallen behind competitor country investments in migration research. We have nothing remotely like Canada's $111 million investment in a centre on migration, migrant integration in the mid-21st century. We need to catch up. As one of the world's most multicultural places, Australia absolutely must have world-leading capacities to understand and manage migration and the large-scale societal challenges that are associated with it. That's why we need a major centre of excellence on migration. Let's think about an analogy. The official cash rate is one of our most powerful tools for managing the economy. And because it's so important, we invest heavily in research to get it right. We have a Reserve Bank with top-notch research capabilities, and we have many well-funded research institutes that focus on the money supply. But when it comes to the migration supply, we don't invest anywhere near as much in getting it right through research. That's short-sighted because the migration supply is probably even more important and powerful than the money supply. It affects who we are and how many of us there are. And that drives, it flows on to determine every aspect of our economy and society. But we only fund these small, isolated, fragmented projects on migration research. The issue's too important for that piecemeal approach to continue. We need to develop or rebuild a system-level understanding that looks at all the pieces of the puzzle on migration. That's why we need to establish a centre of excellence on this issue. We need it to prioritise collaboration among institutions to overcome competition for limited funding, to create a more integrated national migration research system. We need it to cultivate a comprehensive, accessible migration data ecosystem, to leverage big digital data traces, to leverage administrative data that's now been linked in ways that we saw as completely unprecedented just 20 years ago, to advance the research so that we can properly understand and predict migration. We need it to establish a long-term interdisciplinary migration research agenda that moves away from narrow and fragmented projects to a system-wide perspective that looks at the whole migratory process and the way it affects society. And that's critical to forming evidence-based policies about migration. We need a centre like this to conduct continuous migration policy evaluation independently of government to ensure that policies are designed, implemented, and evaluated, and that they're effective. And we need a centre of excellence on migration to rebuild public service capabilities through targeted education and training so that we have a cohort of professionals with proper technical understanding of this issue, because it's a complex issue. It's not a profit-seeking venture that I'm talking about, it's one of public service. Establishing a centre of excellence on migration futures would be a testament to Australia's commitment to leading the world in understanding and managing one of the most critical issues of our time. It will let us harness research to create a future where migration is properly understood not as a threat to be feared, but as an opportunity to be embraced. If we can establish such a centre here in Australia, it will have far-reaching impacts, not just for us, but globally. We'll be able to set an example for all the other countries around the world that are currently struggling to understand and manage migration. To make this a reality, we need to partner with foundations, philanthropists, and other stakeholders, like all of you and your contacts in the room. We've built a consortium of leading universities, of key government departments, key non-governmental organisations. If you'd like to get involved, to donate to our work, or if you can introduce us to interested parties or partners or funders, please let us know. Please join us in building this Centre of Excellence. Thank you again, and now I'll hand over to Lance Bonneau, the Acting Chief of Mission for the IOM Australia, for the vote of thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lance Bonneau, as Helen just said, the Acting Chief of Mission for IOM here in Australia. And it is a great pleasure for me to be able to pass on a vote of thanks. Alan has done so, but I feel that it's deserved to do so again. I'd first like to start with acknowledging the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet, and thank the Shine Dome for hosting us in this iconic space. The ANU Migration Update has become a key annual event in Canberra, gathering migration practitioners from across the country and the world. This year's event is particularly timely as migration has become a central issue in many of the world's elections, amidst widespread disinformation, and my accent probably betrays the fact that my country is having an election which I'm sure everyone here is very much interested to see the outcome, as am I, coming up very soon. So this point of disinformation that we've heard over the course of this is all too familiar, sadly, in my country, but also in many other countries. Our Director General, Amy Pope, stated earlier this year that in a world of grappling with uncertainty, understanding migration dynamics is essential for informed decision-making and effective policy responses. Our goal today has been to counter myths and provide facts to inform the public and elevate the standard of migration debates during this significant year of democracy to ensure the discourse on migration is as multifaceted and nuanced as the migrants themselves. It is certainly not a binary us and them debate, which is self-evident to all of us here, but as we've heard during the presentations and it jumped out what Mari had presented about the 100 years of media drawing from the UK research, the notion of immigration has been predominantly viewed negatively. And when we talk about the political discourse and the debates and the elections, it often is distilled to the us and them, which is very unfortunate. On behalf of the ANU Migration Hub, the International Organization for Migration, and the entire university, I extend my gratitude to all the distinguished speakers and panel chairs for the rich and insightful contributions today and on this complex topic, especially those who traveled from afar. We look forward to continuing our partnership and welcoming you all back to Canberra anytime. IOM has been pleased to be a partner with ANU to organize this important event. Acknowledging ANU's mission is to understand Australia's place in the world, as few issues speak more directly to Australia's identity and international relationships than human mobility. And ANU researchers have played a significant role in shaping Australian migration research and policy over generations. The ANU Migration Hub connects over 100 migration experts across the university and works towards establishing a cluster of migration expertise in the Asia-Pacific region to advance knowledge on population movement, educate future policymakers, and accelerate the translation of research into better migration policies and outcomes. These are aspirations we share and are reflected in IOM's strategic plan, which considers data and evidence as one of the key enablers to deliver the promise of migration. IOM is grateful to be an event partner, and on behalf of the Migration Hub, I would also like to express appreciation for the support and collaboration of the Department of Home Affairs. A special thanks also to Australian National Internship Program and the administrative team led by Chanel Prasad and my colleague Raphael Betancourt. Another vote of thanks for all of your support and the team. And of course to you, Alan, Director of the Migration Hub, for orchestrating this event with IOM. Finally, I want to thank you, the audience, for your participation today. Your engagement is crucial in addressing this complex challenges of migration and leveraging its opportunities, which impact lives, transform societies, and shape economies globally. As opinion shapers and decision makers, it is essential that we all continue to working together to achieve better outcomes in this important field. Several times, Alan had mentioned, the Community of Practice Center of Excellence, and I was just thinking to myself, if somehow we could make the community of practice lead to communities of understanding, we'd all be in a better situation. And that's really the challenge, I think, before us, is that we all understand very well the nuances of migration, the benefits, the richness that it brings, and yet sometimes down at the community level, it is distilled down to the mentality that it's not us, we're not them, and yet looking around, I'm pretty confident that most all of us that are sitting here in one way or another are connected as migrants and connected to migrants. Me speaking here, of course, as well, being here, working on a temporary assignment and coming from another country. It is a very richness that migrants and migration bring to us. If we can get that same message to the local communities, that will go far, I think, in shaping future policies and the debate. Once again, I am delighted that we can facilitate this important work through the annual ANU Migration Update and build stronger partnerships across sectors. Thank you all again for your energy and, of course, for your ideas today. I found it very enriching on a personal level. I've been in IOM a very, very long time, and these types of events, I think, are extremely important, as has been said. And we thank you very much for your participation and contribution.